News breaks like a thunderclap. Former Vice President Dick Cheney has died, age 84. His family citing complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease. Whatever you thought of him, he reshaped the modern vice presidency and the architecture of post-9/11 power, and his passing hangs over Washington today as another fight over presidential power lands before the High Court. That fight is the White House's tariff case, where Plan A is simple. Convince the justices that a 1977 emergency law lets a president slap sweeping duties on imports to manage national security and economic threats. The administration is projecting confidence, but the legal terrain is rough after lower courts said the emergency law never handed over a blank check for global tariffs.
A look at the White House this morning ahead of what could be a pivotal week for the Trump administration. The U.S. Supreme Court will hear arguments Wednesday from businesses and states that say Trump's use of a national security statute to hit nearly every nation with tariffs is illegal. The hearing will combine two cases, one pushing back on Trump's reciprocal tariffs, and another which argues against the fentanyl-related duties that have been placed on Canada, Mexico, and China.
That puts extraordinary leverage on the line, the same kind of leverage Cheney once prized in foreign policy. Inside the West Wing, lawyers and trade hands have spent weeks rehearsing contingencies. If the court trims the emergency tool, they pivot to a patchwork. Section 301 for unfair practices, Section 232 on national security, Section 122 for short, capped bursts tied to trade deficits, and the near-century-old Section 338 for swift retaliation against discriminatory behavior.
With me now is Eric Ham, CTV News U.S. political analyst. Eric, good morning. The U.S. Supreme Court will hear arguments on Wednesday on President Trump's sweeping tariffs. What can we expect?
This is going to be a pretty explosive hearing because we know that so much of Donald Trump's policies, foreign policy, national security policy, is tied directly to his use of tariffs. Now, the president believes that this case, in fact, is so consequential that he himself has said that he may actually even attend the hearing, something we've never seen from a sitting U.S. president. So this is going to be very, very important for the Trump administration, not only because of how they have used the tariffs, but because also we have to remember a lower court also ruled that Trump has actually overstepped his bounds, but yet kept these tariffs in place.
None is as fast or flexible, but together they could keep pressure on trading partners and preserve tariff revenue. Here's the core of Plan A. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act was built for sanctions and targeted economic restrictions in crises. The White House argues tariffs fit within that frame when supply chains and strategic dependencies rise to an emergency. Critics answer that tariffs are taxes, and taxes are Congress's job unless Congress speaks clearly. That's the separation of powers collision now before 9 justices who have shown growing interest in reining in broad delegations. If the emergency lever survives intact, expect the status quo, tariff threats that double as diplomatic cattle prods. If it is narrowed, expect more process and fewer shocks. The White House has already seeded 2 3-2 probes across critical sectors, from metals and autos to semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and minerals. Those cases create a lattice of security-based duties that, assembled, can look a lot like a wall even without the emergency switch. Section 232 is blunt by design. It evaluates whether imports impair national security and usually yields sector-wide remedies. That is great for signaling resolve, but clumsy for surgical bargaining with a single capital. Hit autos and you touch allies and rivals alike. Politically, sector duties mint winners and losers at home, which raises the stakes in an election environment already jittery about prices. That is the trade-off the White House accepts to keep leverage alive. Section 301 is nimbler in targeting specific foreign practices, but it moves at the speed of investigations, not tweets. That is why the fresh case aimed at Brazil matters. It bundles digital services, ethanol, and intellectual property complaints into a single scaffold for negotiations. Replicate that template, and you can rebuild leverage country by country, dossier by dossier. It is slower than an emergency proclamation, but it is legally sturdier ground. Section 122 is the bridge tool, allowing short, limited tariffs tied to balance of payments stress. Think weeks and months, not years. Used well, it can hold the line while a 301 record matures, or a 232 report lands. Used poorly, it looks like a legal fig leaf. Section 338, meanwhile, tempts with speed, but invites a court brawl over how much power Congress tucked into century-old retaliation language. All of this unfolds as Cheney's death reminds Washington what muscular executive power looks like in practice. He championed maximal options for a president in a crisis, a worldview that resonates in today's tariff fight. Allies say constraining the emergency statute would hobble not just trade moves, but broader statecraft, from energy bargaining to wartime pressure. Opponents reply that durable strategy comes from statutes, not improvisation. The court will decide which vision rules. Outside the marble courtroom, the diplomacy is pragmatic. European officials assume tariffs will persist in some form, emergency or no. Businesses are planning for three paths: full win, partial trim, or loss. In the trim scenario, watch for a swarm of sector cases and bilateral 301 filings, fewer lightning bolt announcements, and more process. Markets will prefer the predictability even if prices stay sticky. Leverage changes shape. It does not disappear. There is a quiet risk that keeps budget staff awake: refunds. If the High Court scuttles the core architecture, importers will race to reclaim duties, potentially in the tens of billions. That is not just an accounting headache, it is a political nightmare to cut checks to importers while consumers still feel higher prices. The government's briefs lean hard against that outcome, but the refund specter is part of the urgency behind Plan A. Speed is the other currency. The emergency tool let the president move first and negotiate later, creating facts on the ground that foreign ministers had to reckon with. Remove it, and you re-enter a world of notices, comment periods, and reports. That does not end leverage, it changes the tempo. For firms living shipment to shipment, cadence is strategy. For diplomats, slower cadence means patience can beat brinkmanship. The courtroom script has its own drama. The consolidated case asks two questions. Does the emergency statute actually authorize tariffs like these? And if it does, is that an unconstitutional delegation? The answers could write the next chapter of trade governance. A narrow win might require tighter findings and time limits. A loss could shift the center of gravity back to Congress and to the older menu of trade laws. Either way, tomorrow's negotiators will play by clarified rules. Politics intrudes, as always. Some Republicans are balking at global tariffs, even as they back the president on other fronts, while import-heavy businesses quietly bankroll challenges from conservative legal shops. That intra-right split mirrors the broader public divide over inflation, supply chains, and sovereignty. The White House counters with bravado and a ready Plan B, betting that confidence shapes both markets and opinions inside the court. For households, tariffs are not theory. When copper is taxed, a contractor's spool costs more. When autos face duties, a family car payment swells. When pharmaceuticals are in the crosshairs, hospitals and insurers scramble. Some producers can pass the cost on, others absorb it or shrink. That is why industry reactions have been muted. Many prefer quiet carve-outs to noisy fights. In tariff politics, discretion often beats denunciation. Cheney's legacy also frames the separation of powers question. He spent a career expanding the reach of the executive in crises, arguing that clarity at the top saves time and danger. The court could honor that logic by upholding broad leeway, or it could insist that in peacetime economic battles, Congress must speak plainly when it means to tax. However the opinion reads, it will echo through energy policy, technology controls, and the next confrontation with a strategic rival. If Plan A holds, expect the White House to keep pairing tariffs with non-trade objectives, from migration pressure to conflict diplomacy. If Plan A frays, expect more targeted files, more sector cases, and more bargaining through formal channels. Either way, The smart bet is that tariffs remain a centerpiece of statecraft for the near term, because they are both revenue and leverage, both headline and bargaining chip. The tools may change, the instincts will not. Capitol Hill looms as the wild card. If the justices pare back emergency tariffs, the center of gravity shifts to lawmakers who have mostly preferred to criticize from the bleachers. A real debate over how much unilateral power any president should wield on trade would test party coalitions. Populists want blunt tools. Free traders want process. The likeliest compromise is narrower, time-bound delegations with reporting hoops, which preserves leverage but reins in surprises. Boardrooms are already gaming playbooks. Import-heavy firms sketch scenarios for full win, partial trim, or loss, with hedges tied to each. Contracts now include tariff escalation clauses, supply teams seek dual sourcing, and finance chiefs review duty drawback and exclusion pathways. The nimblest companies treat tariffs like weather, not fate. Diversify lanes, price in disruptions, and cultivate relationships in customs and commerce so they hear shifts before they hit the tape. Abroad, allies calibrate patience. European capitals have learned to parse White House mood music from agency paper. If emergency power survives, they will bargain for carve-outs. If it narrows, they will build coalitions around sector reviews and press for transparency on timelines. In Asia and the Americas, mid-size economies see an opening to court investment by advertising predictability, even if it means aligning with stricter security rules on data, chips, and minerals. There is a legal subtext in separation of powers that will echo past this case. Courts have grown skeptical of statutes that seem to hand the executive a blank check without clear limits. A narrow reading here would not end aggressive trade policy. It would demand sharper findings, tighter tailoring, and periodic renewal. That looks boring, but it is consequential. Agencies write deeper records, challengers get cleaner targets, and businesses gain a little more foresight. Expect the World Trade Organization to lurk in the background. While emergency and security rationales often bypass Geneva, piling on sector defenses and targeted country actions raises dispute risks. Even if panels take years, the prospect of adverse findings can shape remedies. The administration will argue that national security remains non-justiciable, but partners will test that boundary, and any eventual rulings will ripple through how future cases are framed. Politics will personalize the abstractions. Voters do not parse statutory text. They feel whether a car gets pricier, whether a renovation costs more, whether a pharmacy bill jumps. If tariffs are framed as leverage that forces factories home, tolerance rises. If they read as taxes with hazy payoffs, patience thins. That is why messaging has leaned on resilience, reshoring, and national strength. The facts on the ground will decide whether those words land. Watch the refund angle if the court knocks out core pillars. Importers will queue for repayments, and the sums could be large enough to dent revenue projections. The administration can try to cabin refunds with procedural defenses, but prolonged uncertainty helps no one. A legislative patch that validates some duties while clarifying future limits is conceivable, yet it would require cross-party trust that has been in short supply even on boring fiscal fixes. Supply chains will continue to regionalize. Even without the emergency lever, the security-driven map points toward friendshoring in North America and allied hubs in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Tariff risk accelerates trends already pushed by export controls, investment screening, and industrial policy subsidies. For many firms, the real question is not whether to move, but how fast, to where, and with what political insurance should the winds shift again. Diplomatically, the tariff era has taught counterparts to look for side doors. Quiet exemptions, quota swaps, and phase schedules often matter more than headline rates. Expect more of that. Governments will pair public firmness with private flexibility, trading relief for concrete moves on technology safeguards, fentanyl precursors, or energy posture. The practice will look transactional because it is, and critics will call it ad hoc. The defense will be results. Whatever the ruling, the instinct to wield economic statecraft is not going away. Tariffs, sanctions, export controls, investment reviews, and subsidies are now braided into one playbook. The precise legal footing matters, but the strategic direction is set by a world where supply chains are battlegrounds and balance sheets are power. This case will mark a boundary, not an end, and the next negotiation will start the morning after with the tools still on the table.